In this lecture, we will continue our conversation of the cultural pillar of the creative economy. In the last one, we looked at human values and connection with culture. Now we are getting deeper into understanding culture and its connection with the creative economy. So you remember the three pillars here, and we are still at the pillar called culture. What we want to look at now is we want to look at the reproduction of cultures and what does it mean in terms of the value that we assign to culture, right? So Walter Benjamin, in this article, he wrote right after or around World War II, 1936, I believe, is when, there was mass media that was coming in and opinions were shaped in different European countries. And Walter Benjamin, as a scholar, started thinking about what does it mean what is the value of creating art, what is the value of the original art, what does it mean when you start now reproducing art, manually, of course. Does the value of what was created, the original, change if it is manually made by the same person, someone else? How do we attribute value to this? And what happens when it is reproduced, using mechanical technologies and not humans necessarily? So does the value change any further than that? And finally, what happens when culture and art, he started with art, and we are really looking at art in the broader sense of culture. So what happens when it is reproduced mechanically, but also to influence and to really create more consumption of a certain kind of art and culture? What happens to the value? Does it change? So how has it changed from the original value, to something that is now created mechanically for the purpose of consumption? And this is looking at critical reasoning, critical thinking. Walter Benjamin actually was struggling with these questions around that time of the way the environment was at that point in time. So let's go back and see what he's really talking about here. And let's begin with, what does it mean to make art and culture, broadly speaking, right? And how do we as humans assign value to art? So for example, if you're you're around the wilderness area and you are a painter of wilderness. As a painter of wilderness, what happens is when you're creating art, you're really, you're bringing your imagination to life. You're really looking at creative expressions and reflecting those creative expressions in your work of art or work of culture in the same vein. You're also sort of pushing the boundaries in many cases to really have a very different perspective on the surrounding that you're living. And you're reflecting all of this in the work of art that is being created, right? So that's what artists tend to do. And same is the case with, art extended to culture, broadly speaking. So the question is, there is a value, a certain degree of authenticity that's awarded when a work of art is made. And traditionally, that authenticity and credibility, or what is called as the aura, is something that has been valued tremendously, although we don't really look at art or culture as looking at it from an economic perspective, right? We are looking at all these sort of intangible notions and values that are really good for us and important for us because we start associating it with an experience that somebody is having. So the question then arises is, what happens in the same notion of the wilderness painting, for example? What happens if that painting is reproduced now manually by another artist? So for example, you have another artist who is an apprentice with this great master artist, right, who's been doing wilderness painting. So the question is, when an apprentice is learning, and a master artist engages an apprentice in order to not only teach and educate, but also to disseminate his or her work of art to greater people for dissemination purposes. So when that art is reproduced by someone else, an apprentice, does the value change, right? Is there a unique answer to this? I believe no. We all will have our own perspectives to this. But the fact is, the value has shifted from what we assign to the original to something that is a copy and made by it. But maybe, we tend to value the fact that the person who is reproducing is also sort of living the experience, is learning in this process, and we do emphasize that quite a bit. I would, certainly. And the value exists. The credibility, probably authenticity, the aura has shifted a little bit, but the fact is maybe it's still quite high in our minds, right? So that's sort of the question of when art is being reproduced manually. And this notion of craftsmanship has existed for a long time. From ages we know that apprentice model has been around, and that's how different kinds of arts and crafts and cultures have fostered from a generation to another generation. But we also know that technology has evolved a lot during this time, and technology has played a role in how art is made, works of art and culture are made. So for example, you have the painting example we are talking about. What happens when, photography came, the technology for that came about. So the question now is, you go from a painting to photography, and you're looking at photography in the context of wilderness painting. You're now reproducing that art a little more mechanically because it's been painted. Maybe you're taking pictures and you're making several copies of the painting, and it's being now disseminated to larger audience, maybe larger audience, faster, cheaper, greater access. Maybe there are people who otherwise would have never had access to this fabulous wilderness painting and the thought processes that went behind creating the painting. So the question is, once it is mechanically reproduced, does its value further diminish in some form, or does it remain the same, right? That's what we are really talking about over here. And the question is, again, is there a unique answer? Is it wrong to do this? This is a social issue and topic, and we all can have our own opinions in the social system, social world. Nothing is really, there is no universal truth, unlike natural sciences, right? So, but if we examine this critically, the authenticity, the expertise, the credibility, and the experience that was reflected, the worldview that was reflected in the original versus something that is reproduced mechanically using technology is different for sure, right? That's what we want to acknowledge here and say that so mechanical reproduction happens. But now, if you want to push this a point further, what happens when this painting, for this case, in this example, is mechanically reproduced for the purpose of purely consumption, in the sense that you want to just make sure that the painting lands in the hands of 100,000 people around the world. And as a part of this, when we say consumption, there is also the goal that you want to influence and change someone's thinking, and you want to change it give it a direction and produce an outcome by virtue of consumption. And sometimes there is an economic outcome associated with it. Maybe there isn't an economic outcome. So if you're talking about fashion, for example, and you're really pushing the consumption of certain kind of fashion and helping people develop a taste for a fashion, that's mechanical reproduction for consumption, because you want to intentionally promote certain kind of fashion and a sense of fashion amongst people. Now, whether doing that is right or wrong, again, remains a question. And is it ethical? What kinds of fostering of consumption is ethical, and where do you cross the ethical boundaries? That's a separate question that arises from here, more so in today's world. But back then, when Walter Benjamin was thinking about this, he was looking at the political climate that was happening around and the mass media industry that was taking shape, which is when, for the first time, the term cultural industries was coined, because a certain culture was promoted through mechanical reproduction and for the purpose of influencing people's thought processes and behaviors. So this question of mechanical reproduction for consumption was very critical then. It is critical now as well, right? How do we decide in our day-to-day thinking whether we are being influenced unknowingly by looking at the several advertisements that keep coming up on mass media and the internet? Are we being influenced without we being aware of it? That's a question we want to think about in today's time. So there's a good TED Talk and an article that came out maybe a couple years ago on, are we at a point where we are going through a paradigm shift now of what used to be an artist and value of the original associated with an artist? Is that diminishing to the extent where we are now is actually more of creatives? We look at individuals more as creatives versus artists. And the reason we say this is because technology, globalization has made things so easy, so accessible, and has put it in the hands of the artist, who would be the traditional artist and maybe the privileged few in many ways. Has it put things in the hands of people now so that almost everyone can be an artist in some regards, right? That's what this TED Talk is about. So I encourage you to watch this TED Talk, and let's look at what is being said in this TED Talk, or the author who also wrote this article here. What the author is challenging is, does the conventional notion of artist and the value of art or the value of culture make sense anymore in the times that we live? Instead, should we be valuing the notion of a creator? Because the fact is, we all can carry multiple identities very easily now. I can be a photographer of wilderness photography. At the same time, with the tools that I have, I can be a storyteller. I can take my experience of wilderness photography and create a story out of it, and I can disseminate that story to many different audiences. In fact, I can engage my audiences in this process to really help me think and decide what kind of stories I want to tell that my audiences are looking for and thinking about and are wanting to have. So now the boundaries between a creator and a consumer, or a producer and a consumer, start to blur. And it becomes what is also being called as prosumer, is a term that is being used now to indicate the sort of porous boundaries that exist. The fact that for such kind of art, culture, value that is being created, we no longer can apply the gatekeepers and credibility that existed maybe 15 or 50, 100 years ago, in terms of, for example, good artwork was found in museums and galleries, right? And they were kind of the gatekeepers as to what is good art. But that no longer exists or is not relevant, I would say, as much relevant in contemporary times. So how do we legitimate works of art? And it's actually people who are consuming more and more are becoming a part of legitimizing the value that's being created from art and culture. So with all of this, clearly what we're seeing is that a lot of innovation is possible using art and culture. Some of our old notions are changing, and this is where it really blends into the creative economy. This last piece that I have here is a fabulous innovation of using technology and its orchestra performances. So I want you to take a listen and just let this sink in with you, the concepts that we had in this lecture here. Let them sink in with you in the form of this particular video over here.
Soundbox is a formerly, I have to say, utterly despised rehearsal space. People hated to play in here.
But now this cavernous room is the hottest new performance space for the San Francisco Symphony. It's called Soundbox. And what makes this place possible is the same thing that makes it seem impossible: terrible acoustics.
So if you look around this space here, all of the walls and the ceiling are treated with a thick absorptive material. So even though this room is pretty large, it actually doesn't sound very large. It sounds really small. That can be very unsatisfying as a musician to perform in, and unsatisfying for the audience too, although it is really beneficial for controlling sound.
That's where the sound system comes in. Soundbox uses a system that can adjust the acoustics of the room with a touch of a button. Well, a few buttons.
So right now we're in the constellation setting Tall Cathedral, and I'll clap so you can hear the reverberation. And now we'll turn the system off, and I'll clap so you can hear how unreverberant it is. So the way it works is we have 28 microphones overhead and 85 loudspeakers overhead and on the walls. And so in real time, it's cycling the sound through the space, adding reflections as if the walls were further out, as if the ceiling were taller, and as if the surface material were hard instead of soft and absorptive.
Having a space where the acoustics can be customized so precisely lets the symphony perform a diverse array of music here.
So if we're playing a piece from Middle Ages that was performed originally in a cathedral, we can change the sound in this room to have the sort of delay and roll-off that would exist in an actual cathedral. And if we go to a very contemporary piece that was designed to be done in a studio, perhaps with complete flat, instantaneous kind of acoustic, we can also do that, and anything in between.
While this level of sound manipulation may not sit right with some traditional symphony goers, almost everything about Soundbox defies tradition. Instead of assigned seats, you can sit on an ottoman or just stand up. The bar doesn't just serve drinks at intermission. You can get a cocktail anytime.
Soundbox is a very free space. It's a kind of play space, kind of laboratory. It's a kind of prototype for testing out what experiences might be part of the concert-going experience.
The symphony puts on 5 programs per year at Soundbox. The space only accommodates 500 people, and tickets generally sell out within a couple of hours of going on sale.
My very dear old friend, Frank Gehry, has said that he was fortunate enough to live in a time when technology finally caught up to where his dreams had always been. And that's what I'm experiencing now as well.